to all of you here in the Kellogg Hub, and also to those of us who are joining us virtually from all around the world. We are so pleased to have you with us. Before I hand over to our speaker this afternoon, just a few housekeeping points. Just to note that the session is being live streamed and that we have a photographer and videographer with us. I'd also like to ask that you put mobile phones on silent or switch them off, please. There will be time at the end of the session to ask questions. And for those of you who are with us in the hub, just raise a hand and we'll bring a microphone to you. For those of you who are joining us online, please put your questions in the chat and my colleague Nicola will read them out on your behalf. So without further ado, it's my very great pleasure to welcome Dr. Anna Beer, visiting fellow of Kellogg College and member of the English faculty. Anna, over to you.
I have my instructions to click on got it. Hello, thank you for coming here and to Kellogg College, which has been such an important part of my life in Oxford. And I think it's fair to say that I wouldn't have been able to write a book like this unless I was a member of this very special place. Really believes in taking scholarship, taking the work of the academy out into the wider world. And that in some ways is a lot of what I do. Now, I have to do another bit of sharing screen. And I'm hoping, oh, no, from beginning, there we are. And I'm hoping, good. Eve Bites Back, subtitle, An Alternative History of English Literature. And that word "an" is very important because I'm not trying to rewrite the entirety of our cultural history. I'm simply offering an alternative to some of the more traditional ways of understanding where the books we read today come from, and some of the values that have determined who writes and who writes what, and also what survives. So there are so many things that I could talk about today, and it was truly difficult to try to decide what to focus on. So I've gone for a compromise, which I hope works. I'm going to whiz through the authors that I chose to feature in this book, which, as you can imagine, 500 years of literary history was quite a tough decision in the first place. And I'm going to pause on 2, 3, 4 of them. Oh, thank you. Thank you. I knew I couldn't possibly get all the technology right. I'm going to pause on 2, 3, 4 of them and read a little bit from the book. But I do want to leave lots of time for questions at the end. So, where to begin? My 2 first authors are well-known figures, really. Julian of Norwich and Marjorie Kemp. And one of the reasons, obviously, that they get into the book, they're writing in the late 14th, early 15th century, is that they are exceptional. Not only are they women who write, but their work survives. And Julian of Norwich's Revelations of Divine Love are, many people in this room will know that work. And I'll come back to this right at the end, this particular weekend, this week, because some of her most famous words are in a stained glass window in St. James's Palace in the late Queen's private chapel there. And I thought it was particularly moving to think about the power of those words 500, 600 years on to provide comfort. If you don't know them, they begin, all shall be well, and all manner of things shall be well. But I will end with that, I think. So here you have a manuscript page from Julian of Norwich's Revelations, and here you have a manuscript page from the book of Marjorie Kemp, written shortly a generation after Julian of Norwich's Revelations. But remarkably, the 2 women met These are exceptional women in that they're writers and their work survives for us, but it's even more exceptional that we know, or at least Marjorie Kemp records, that she met with Julian of Norwich in Norwich in the early 15th century. So I want to start with Marjorie Kemp and the book of Marjorie Kemp, a work written almost entirely in the third person. So who actually wrote it? We're not entirely sure. One straightforward answer offered by many people, if only to get women on the literary history radar, is that Marjorie Kemp, born in Lynn in Norfolk in around 1373, wrote the book. This makes her the first woman to write an autobiography in English. Hurrah, you might want to say. For all the feminist mileage in this, the first past the post approach, the answer looks simplistic from the first page of the book, in which Marjorie Kemp appears as a character. This creature she's described as. The male scribes who report the experiences and insights and memories of the creature are, it seems, the actual authors, with Kemp merely the source of the work's material. Indeed, the activities of the scribes, listeners, amanuenses, and collaborators are foregrounded throughout the text, so that the reader can never forget that this is a work that has been created for the illiterate Marjorie by the hands of others. So the most extreme answer to the question, who wrote the book of Marjorie Kemp, is that it is entirely the creation of male scribes and clerics who, even if a woman's experience provided the raw material, and even that is not accepted by all, they wrote or rewrote the text so completely that it becomes theirs, it becomes men's work. If you accept that, the book of Marjorie Kemp should be thrown out of my chapter 1, thrown out of my book entirely, or not. And here's my argument of why it needs to be in there. And a number of these points I'm going to make resonate through the centuries. They are not only relevant to the 14th, 15th century. For starters, Kemp is the dominant figure, both within and outside the text. It is the creature, for example, who is described as controlling the manuscript's moment of creation, waiting for 20 years to pull the trigger. And there are other hints that the creature may not be, in fact, illiterate, what we might call illiterate. Her guard slips when very occasionally she mentions reading or hearing things read. Perhaps Kemp, Marjorie Kemp, the real flesh and blood woman, is being strategic as her previous contemporary or near contemporary Julian of Norwich, who presents herself, Julian of Norwich writes the most exquisite, theologically nuanced, intellectual work, but describes herself as a simple creature unlettered in the midst of a text that shows her to be anything but unlettered and simple. So is it a modesty thing, a way to hide? Some scholars go even further. They argue that the male scribes in the book are sophisticated fictions created to legitimize Kemp's literary creation and deflect criticism from her authorship. No scribes, therefore, but a woman of, and I quote, 40-something, that age thought of as post-menopausable, menopausable? I made a word. No comment, if anyone could edit. That age, in fact, that should be my next book, menopausable. Thought of as post-menopausal and thus less female, in which so many medieval women began to write, and not just medieval women. And this woman sits down to record a series of visions and adventures that occurred some years before. That's the scholar Lynn Staley. Put another way, even if the scribes had not existed, Kemp would have been required to invent them, if only to give her words the authority of the church. That word authority resounds through every chapter of this book. Every woman I write about has to find a way to assert her authority as a writer. Think of the source of the word, author, autor, authority, without invoking the problem, with huge quote marks around it, of being a woman. And it's squaring that circle that haunts every single chapter of this book. Even writers who we now know and are in a lifeblood of our English literature. Jane Austen had to do it, for example. A few more words about Marjorie Kemp before I move on to 150 years later. Was Marjorie Kemp perfectly capable of writing her own book, but used the fiction of male scribes to authorize her foray into the male world of authorship? And I think we need a subtle definition, or a more subtle definition, of literacy to answer that question. And again, this is one of the themes of the book. What is literature? What is literacy? The book records that Marjorie could no letter, that she's unable to understand Latin, that she cannot even read her own name in a vision of the Book of Life. Yet, her book is filled with echoes of and quotations from other narratives, works that were read to the creature, preached to her, stories experienced by her in mystery plays, liturgical processions, church murals, stained glass windows. It's a much more exciting understanding of how you relate to stories than simply me standing here with a book in front of us. And it's changing around us now. I'm not sure how often my daughters, for example, read actual books. They are hearing literature far more. They are watching it. Kemp engages with scripture, both orally, verbally, and hourly. She can even quote Latin if it is from the Psalter. She has heard it enough times. It doesn't do her any good in this particular confrontation. She's intellectually, she wins the argument by citing scripture, but her opponents are so horrified that she's doing that in the first place that they double down on their criticisms of her. In other words, Marjorie is in fact literate, in the sense she has knowledge of literature, even if she might not actually be able to read, let alone form letters. And this brings us into, that's the norm in her life. Most of her contemporaries, men and women, used scribes. Almost all of her contemporaries accessed texts orally, hourly, rather than visually. Even those who could read often chose not to do so, preferring to hear books in group settings, while solitary reading was usually conducted aloud. Writing was performed orally by dictation, not least because the act of transcription, the craft of the scribe, was so challenging. Even before ink could be applied to vellum, both materials had to be created. An animal carcass would be soaked in lime solution to remove hair and flesh, stretched, bleached, and scraped to create an even thickness, then cut to create the pages. Oak galls needed to be collected as the swellings on oak trees formed around gall wasp eggs, smashed into powder, mixed with copperas, iron sulfate, covered with water, left in the sun for days, mixed with gum arabic. Then your quill, a feather from a goose or a swan, the nib cut with a penknife. A chain of people, animal, and insects went into the making of the vellum, ink, and pen, even before a word was set down. For me, this process is emblematic of a time and world in which books were shared, in which reading and writing were neither solitary nor silent activities. And that is how I see Marjorie Kemp, and that's why I wanted to start with her. I see her not as reliant on scribes. She is creatively collaborating with them. I would go further. I find it hard to see any literary work of this era, and dare I say, any era, as emerging from a solitary individual. And this fact, in and of itself, leads us to misunderstand and indeed devalue women's achievements, and of course others who have been excluded from our histories. Collaboration in the medieval era, and as I argued throughout the book, is built in to creativity. All the more so for women, who even if they operated behind the screen of anonymity, which many of them did, would need to work with others, whether practically getting the materials necessary to write, employing the skills of a scribe, or institutionally. I stand in an institution saying that, gaining permission from their superiors to create and circulate a piece of writing. And so when I see the words, a priest who wrote this book, when I see at the bottom of the image, you can see, and you may not be able to see it very clearly, but it tells us this was penned by a monk from Salthouse, a village on the coast of Norfolk, fairly close to Norwich. When I see the words, the priest who wrote this book, I imagine a cleric transcribing Marjorie's words, preparing his quill, scraping off mistakes with his knife, perhaps trying to keep the sheets of vellum in order. I can even imagine the young priest who was Kemp's most significant collaborator, a man with whom she read books for 7 or 8 years. That's a long time of reading together. 3 times, nearly 3 times an undergraduate degree. I see a reciprocal relationship, with Marjorie causing the priest to, as he says, read much good scripture and many a good doctor, which he would not have looked at that time had she not been. And she provides him with spiritual solace. Her male scribe finds writing to be an emotional experience with intense bodily reactions. He who was her writer sometimes could not stop himself from weeping. Marjorie Kemp is weeper extraordinaire. If you don't know her, she could cry for days. One of the reasons people reacted very strongly against her. In other words, this is not Marjorie being read to, but reading with someone. And that someone is as much her son as she is God's daughter. The book never names the priest, despite Marjorie being devoted to him. A reminder that we have a very modern need to put names and places to people. We also have a very modern need for timelines. But again, I can talk about that a bit more later, maybe. Rather than to understand the priest by what he does, how much more would we actually know of him if we found out he was called Brian, for example? One more point about Marjorie before I go on to my whistle-top tour through the book, but it's again something that I think resonates, I hope resonates through the chapters. None of this, the collaboration, the illiteracy, or a different kind of literacy, whatever we want to call it, writing about her being she's a creature in the third person. None of this makes Marjorie Kemp any less of an author, because although I see the young priest, I also read this. Read it slowly. Look out for the 2 times I use the word writing. And she was ill many times during the writing of this treatise. And as soon as she set about the writing of this treatise, she was suddenly healthy and fit. Now, in one sense, that doesn't make sense. She's ill when she's writing, she's suddenly healthy and fit when she's writing. But I think 2 kinds of writing are in play here, although the same word, writing, is used in the original. I'd like to think, I can't prove it, of course, that there is a contrast being made between those times when the book was being written for her, during which Marjorie was frequently ill, and the times when she is more actively engaged with the writing, during which her health is restored. And that is one of the things that ties every single woman in this book, for all their differences of class, of upbringing, of genre, even of well, everything, so different. Julian and Marjorie Kemp, completely different women. Julian closeted in an anchorite cell. She's scrabbling in the dirt to dig her own grave. And from there, in this enclosed space, she writes her revelations of divine love. Marjorie, inveterate traveler, goes on pilgrimage everywhere from Jerusalem to Bridlington and all points in between, has an amazing time. 2 completely different women, both driven by needing, wanting to write. And I was interviewed by an American podcast series just this week about this book. And the man, they threw me a couple of curveball questions at the end. One of them was, would you like to spend a day with one of these women, or would you like to have all 8 of them in a room and you can just eavesdrop? And I definitely went for the second one. And he asked me to think about what they would be talking about for all their differences of era and experience and lives. And I said, I think the one thing they would all say, do not take my pen, my paper, do not take my manuscript, do not take my typewriter away from me. I must write. And that links all these women and their attempts to make sure that was part of their life. Right, onward. My next text is, I can't say this in Oxford because there will be somebody who's written an academic monograph about this book sitting in this room, but probably unfamiliar to you. Salve Deus Rex Judorum, Hail God King of the Jews, by Emilia Lanya, contemporary of Shakespeare. And sadly, I don't have time to go into details about this remarkable collection of poems. She gets into some literary histories as the first woman to publish an original volume of poetry in 1611. 1611 is the year of Shakespeare's final sole authored play, The Tempest. It's also the year in which the King James Bible appears, 2 iconic works of English literature, but also the year in which this small volume of remarkable poems came into the world. If you go away today with only one resolution, I'd say hunt down this work. It is stunningly good. It punches way above its weight. Emilia Lanya also gets into our histories sometimes as a candidate for being Shakespeare's Dark Lady. The words I would use for that theory are unprintable and unrecordable, but I would suggest it's not true. Salve Deus Rex Judorum. That brings us to the beginning of the 17th century, to Shakespeare's world. The final thing I'll say about this one is that second title. So she retells the Passion of Christ, Christ's crucifixion. It's a remarkable retelling. And then she rewrites Genesis. And the clue is in the title of this book, Eve Bites Back. Every writer has, in some sense, to grapple with the legacy of Eve and what happened in the Garden of Eden, how Eve brought evil and death into the world, brought sin into the world. And Julian of Norwich and Marjorie Kemp sidestep that. They tackle an awful lot of other things, but they sidestep Eve. Lanya doesn't. She goes right in there and she rewrites Genesis. It's great. On to my next writer, Anne Bradstreet. Her name is not on this title page. She is merely presented as, at the bottom there, as by a gentlewoman in those parts. And at the top, it tells you which parts those are, America. And Anne Bradstreet gets into our literary histories as the first American woman to be published, full stop. The first American to be published. And this is in 1650. The work was actually published on this side of the Atlantic. Anne Bradstreet was one of the early settlers, immigrants, colonizers in Massachusetts. For me, writing the chapter about Anne Bradstreet was tough because I'd come across her in the past, as I've come across Emilia Lanya. Those of you who know my work will know that I'm a 16th, 17th century political literature specialist. And Anne Bradstreet borrows heavily from my main man, Sir Walter Raleigh. I did my thesis about him. I've written books about him. Yes, I've lived Sir Walter Raleigh for far too long. She was very inspired by his history of the world, and she wrote a poetic version of it. So that's how I'd come across her. I hadn't looked into her life at all. I hadn't thought about what it would be to be one of families going across to Massachusetts. And I hadn't thought about slavery. I hadn't thought about the effect of the incoming settlers on the indigenous populations. And what I had to confront is Anne Bradstreet's determined refusal to acknowledge any of that. It's just not in her writing at all. And again, no time to talk about it today, sadly, but that's another strand in this book. I'm telling an alternative history of English literature, but I'm also touching on other alternative histories that haven't got as fully as they should into our mainstream. And that includes the history of slavery, of people of colour, and of the impact of the British colonial endeavour spreading English through the world and spreading our literature through the world. My next author, Aphra Behn, many of you will know, and so we're into the late 17th century. She gets into the literary history books, partly due to the good offices or poisoned pen or poisoned chalice of Virginia Woolf and Vita Sackville-West, saying she should be in there. The terms in which they decided that Aphra Behn should be in the canon, should be acknowledged, were so damning with faint praise. It was rather like Samuel Johnson's, you know, it's remarkable to see a dog dance on its hind legs. It's remarkable to see a woman writing, but, you know, do we really want to see this? They were pretty much the same, Woolf and Sackville-West. Great, she did it. And she made money from it. And that was their point. Great, a woman makes money from her writing, the first professional writer. But she was no better than a harlot. And that I could spend hours talking about in every single chapter, in every century, this same equation of literary creativity, of public performance of any kind, and that includes publication, is conflated with sex work. And this may sound like a crass simplification. I wish it were. It just isn't. It comes in different forms, in different words, in every single century. Aphra Behn hit it full on, competing in the very male, very testosterone-laden, very libertine world of the Restoration theatre, surrounded by men like John Wilmot, Earl of Rochester, or William Wycherley. And writing that chapter actually was quite challenging because Behn, her strategy, her survival strategy is to just run with the lads. Those who were around in the 1990s and the idea of lad culture or ladettes will recognize this, of women conforming to male stereotypes of behavior, getting as drunk as the men, being as loose as the men, being as foul-mouthed as the men, thinking somehow that gets you into the men's club. Aphra Behn did the same. It doesn't work. I wanted to put up a couple of images of the books themselves because underlying there are two drives, two creative ideas that kicked off this book. First was, it was going to be a book solely about Emilia Lanya and that remarkable collection of poems, Salve Deus Rex Judorum. And I don't know whether to be grateful or to curse my publisher and my agent, who, when I presented them with this nuanced, beautifully written proposal about this remarkable woman who had the most interesting and fascinating of lives, and as I say, produced this work of genius, they said, but we're not going to be able to sell this. It's one woman, people aren't interested. And they said, go bigger, go larger. And I said, no, I can't. And then I thought, why not? And I had just finished a biography of Shakespeare. And I thought, if I've got the chutzpah to write a biography of Shakespeare, then why not try to do the same for these women writers that I loved? So I went larger. But the other thought I had, the Emilia Lanya book, the working title was The Making of Salve Deus Rex Judorum. And I wanted to trace, as I almost was doing with the vellum and the gall and the ink, the making of a book. Where the paper comes from, where the pens come from, where the ink comes from, how you get a publishing license, how you learn to read, write, form letters, everything that came into making that little collection of poems. And so the books themselves have been really important to me, not just thinking about the women and what they experienced and how they found their way to be an author, but how the books were made. And it is always a struggle. And this was a book written in lockdown. So the times I could get into libraries and actually look at old books were very rare. And then finally, I was allowed. And so I was looking at this early edition of The Rover, seeing it. It was very, very moving for me. And so was seeing this book. which you have to fill in the gaps, is letters of the Right Honourable Lady Mary Wortley Montagu, written during her travels in Europe, Asia and Africa. And this was a book that I knew had to be in there for all sorts of reasons. I love traveling, I love travel writing, and this is a truly brilliant, dazzling work of travel writing, describing a trip, a journey from London to the heart of the Ottoman Empire, Constantinople, Turkey, as it now is, Bulgaria on the way, Ottoman controlled at the time, by Lady Mary Wortley Montagu. She did the journey in 1716. If you look carefully at the Roman numerals at the bottom, you'll see that this book did not appear until 1766, 50 years on. And I do want to pause for a moment about how this book came into being. And also why it's not just because it's a travelogue that I wanted it in there, not just because she's an incredible writer, but because it's another corrective. I mentioned about literacy earlier on and different understandings of that. This is a book that makes us think again about how a writer leaves a legacy. Lady Mary Wortley Montagu, the clue is in the word lady, was elite. She was as privileged as you can get in this country. And it meant, though she didn't have a conventional education, she wasn't sent to school because the real upper classes don't do that, she had access to her father's libraries, and they were many and legion. And she educated herself. She, like Jane Austen, like many of the other people in this book, started writing early and young and brilliantly and in several languages. So we've got this utterly dazzlingly brilliant teenager, self-taught, all the rest of it. She writes, she literally puts pen to paper every day of her life. We know this. There are volumes and volumes, we know, 19, 20, 21 volumes of diaries, letters, thousands of letters. Journalism. She started up a newspaper, The Nonsense of Common Sense. I always think of John Major at that point, The Nonsense of Common Sense. And she was a writer through and through. Poetry, romances, translations, every day of her life. She did not publish. She did not publish anything. And even her journalism, she did not put her name to, even though she was editing this incredible new thing, a newspaper. She led a remarkably varied life, traveled widely, including, as I say, this early journey, ended up in Italy. Intriguing life. I haven't got time. She also was, I promised myself I would not get distracted by Lady Mary's life because there's an important thing I need to say. She's in her 60s. She is ill. She's in Italy, where she's been for an awfully long time, having adventures. She has cancer, she is dying, and finally she decides to come back to England. There are things to sort out, things to lay to rest. And she makes her journey in the winter. And in Rotterdam, just before her final boat trip back to London, and surely death, she hands over 2 booklets, manuscript booklets, to somebody she hardly knows. And she says, do with these what you will. And then she returns to London, she dies. The family are scrabbling around, desperate to make sure that every single piece of writing that she's ever done is burned, for good reason. She operated in very high circles, was perhaps not entirely discreet. But these 2 little books she gave to a clergyman in Rotterdam. The family were comfortable. They thought, well, nothing will happen to them. He just kept them and that's fine. But he gave them to a young man whose father was a printer to read overnight. Young man, seeing a good thing when he saw it, copied it out. And that is what allows us to have this printed copy, which comes out after Lady Mary Wortley's death. And as I say, this is the only print publication that we have. The publishers made it very exciting. I wonder if I can get rid of myself, but it ends on an exciting moment when Lady Mary, traveling to Sofia in Bulgaria now, goes to the women's baths. And it's a famous moment, actually. She arrives fully dressed. Those of you who've been to Turkish baths, Ottoman baths, will know that you go in naked. And so the women just look at her and are horrified and say, does your husband force you to wear these clothes? Does he lock you up in your corset? And she is utterly confused by this moment of cultural incomprehension. And she stutters, no, of course my husband doesn't, but she doesn't get naked, but she does give the inside track on the women's baths in the Ottoman world. And that's where her publishers decide to end the first volume. That's a portrait of Lady Mary going full Turk. She loved her time there. She absolutely adored it. There's her son, who was yet to become a major problem. He was. And there she is again in Oriental dress. I mentioned earlier there are other histories that I touch on in the book, and you can catch a glimpse of one of them here, hiding behind, in the shadows behind Lady Mary Wortley Montagu, is a small black child. Scholars, as we are wont to do, tangle ourselves up in knots to say, well, it can't possibly be a slave. Lady Mary Wortley Montagu was a Whig, she was opposed to slavery. No, she wasn't. It was absolutely a given of her life. She can go through the Ottoman Empire and challenge Islamophobia. She can embrace all the wisdom and beauty of Islam, but she's entirely blind to slavery in all its forms. And unfortunately, she is also what we would call racist when it comes to Black Africans and Jewish people. Now, one of the things I write about in the book is, why should we expect women of the past to do our heavy lifting? Why should we expect them to be intersectional feminists? Why should we expect them to see the world through perhaps our 21st century eyes? We shouldn't expect, but we certainly shouldn't airbrush out the moments where they will give with one hand visions of equality, freedom, liberty, and take away with another. And again, that's a theme of the book, that for all the acts of generosity to fellow women, there are also numerous moments when women seek to gain that authority that I began by talking about. The desperate need to assert their own authority means punching down on people other than themselves. They may be other women, it may be working class people, it may be people of colour, it may be Jews, it may be whoever their rivals are. But that struggle, it doesn't excuse it. It doesn't excuse punching down on your competitors or people you see as different from yourself. But again, very sadly, I see that as a strain still in our culture now, women being pitted against each other for the sake of some culture wars that don't actually enable anybody else. You may recognize this next figure, Jane Austen. She's in the book because I wanted somebody utterly familiar that we think we know in there, but her story starts looking a little bit different when placed alongside some of the other women in the book. And so many of the struggles that these other women who we don't know faced, she faced as well. And she overcame them in a particular way that means she stays in our world now. Dare I say, she's the right kind of woman author. She's also in there because I've lived with Jane Austen since I was a little girl. She has been part of my life. And for many of you in this room, I'm sure that's the same. And that was another reason this was a difficult chapter to write, looking at her work, her life again, in a different timeline, not just in the sense of the rise of the novel in some abstract sense. So Jane Austen is most definitely there. I said she's the right kind of woman, and that's in part because the legacy making of her family, who constructed her as a good woman. And that's another burden that every single woman in this book has to carry. To be a woman, to be taken seriously, you have to be good, you have to be virtuous in however your society defines as goodness and virtue. And for Jane Austen's family, that included saying things like everything dropped from her pen without any trouble at all. I'm paraphrasing some of the comments. Everything she wrote was publishable. It was easy for her. If if you look at the manuscripts, it's not easy for her. She edits, she edits, she edits, she scratches through, she revises endings, as any of you have read Persuasion will know. She abandons books. She works so hard to give us the works of genius that we have. So, as Professor Catherine Sutherland says, to describe her works dropping from her pen, or to say that she folded paper beautifully, is an absurd, to quote Sutherland, absurd substitution for genius. The other reason I mentioned the struggles that Austen faced, I'm ashamed to say I didn't know this. Studied, worked, read, enjoyed Jane Austen for decades. I didn't realise there was years, decades between her starting out as a writer, sharing her work with her family and friends, and getting published. It was a huge struggle. And we might want to call it self-publishing in the end. She put up the money, or her brothers put up the money. So Jane Austen starts looking a bit more different, set in a different timeline. But I want to end with my final author, who some of you may know. I'm going to risk a show of hands. Who knows M.E. Braddon or Mary Elizabeth Braddon and her work, Lady Audley's Secret? A handful of people do. But for many of you, this is a joy still to come. And this is the only point in the book where I say, stop reading now. Go and read the book and then come back and finish it, because she is a novelist of suspense, page turners, cliffhangers. You can see her first book, The Trail of the Serpent. I thought I was, quite a cool, urbane character. This shocked me. There's a death in chapter 3 that comes, whoa, she's good, she's good. So this was her very first book. I would love to spend hours, days talking about Mary Elizabeth Braddon, who is a woman after my own heart. This book, The Trail of the Serpent, as I say, was her first published book. Her breakthrough book was Lady Audley's Secret. And I just want to tell you a little bit about the genesis of that book. Okay, so Mary Elizabeth Braddon has come to London, and she's actually, The Trail of the Serpent is a reissue of an earlier book that she'd written in installments, as so many 19th century novelists did. It was reissued with a new title, and there is a modern edition, The Trail of the Serpent, if you want to be shocked, in chapter 3, introduced by Sarah Waters, who's rather good at suspense and horror as well. And she reminds us that this may be the first British detective novel. So Braddon is right in at the beginning of that genre. As I mentioned, it was a reissue, it was rebranded, change of title, and it sold in its new title 1,000 copies in 7 days. And her publisher, John Maxwell, on the back of that, appointed Braddon as chief serial writer for a new ultra-cheap magazine for working class readers, the Halfpenny Journal, with her mother, Fanny, as editor. Yeah, Mary's mother is quite an interesting person as well. The next part of the story is the stuff of legend. John Maxwell, as he was wont to do, launched yet another magazine, this time a 2-penny weekly, Robin Goodfellow. You can see a page from it up here. For some reason, the writer of the lead serial failed to deliver just before the first copies were due to appear. Maxwell considered delaying, but then Miss Braddon heard of the difficulty. It was pointed out to her that there was no time. "How long could you give me?" asked the aspiring authoress. "Until tomorrow morning." "At what time tomorrow morning?" "If the first instalment were on my breakfast table tomorrow morning," he replied, indicating by his tone and manner the utter impossibility of the thing, "it would be in time." Actually, reading this in Oxford, I remember my own undergraduate years here and essay crises. I think Mary Elizabeth Braddon would have sailed through. The next morning, the publisher found upon his breakfast table the opening chapters of Lady Audley's Secret. It is a great story, and given Braddon's phenomenal productivity, it might even be true. And so it came to pass that in July 1861, the first instalment of Lady Audley's Secret appeared, produced overnight by its prodigious author, and ending with the requisite cliffhanger. Somewhat pathetically, the serial came to an abrupt close at the end of September, not because Lady Audley's story had been told, but because Robin Goodfellow folded. Maxwell's magazines had a tendency to do this. Undeterred, Braddon started on a new novel, Aurora Floyd, whilst continuing to produce her pulp fiction serials. But such was the interest in Lady Audley's Secret, she was begged to complete it. She was happy to do so. What was one more novel on top of the 3 or 4 on her desk? And Lady Audley wrote again from February 1862, now in the Sixpenny magazine. By the time the final instalment of Lady Audley's Secret appeared on the first day of 1863, Braddon's career was soaring. In the early months, she'd been directly up against none other than Charles Dickens, with installments of Great Expectations appearing in all the year round. She should probably have sunk without trace against that kind of competition. But instead, and in response to demands by readers who wished her to continue, she reinitiated serialization. A few months later, she made a lucrative deal, and on. The circulating libraries got hold of it. There were West End performances and Whitechapel performances of it. I can guess which ones were more fun. And her earlier novels and anything she was writing on her desk were rushed out in cheap editions. Yeah, she wrote under 2 or 3 other pseudonyms as well. Okay. When her publishers, the Tinsley brothers, launched an aggressive marketing campaign, spending several £100s advertising both Lady Audley and its author, they need hardly have bothered. Braddon's work was everywhere. Now, hugely successful, decades of a career as a writer, continuing right up to her death in 1915. There's some very touching letters from her as the First World War breaks out. She's writing well into her 70s, even to her 80s. I can't resist showing you the kind of pulp fiction that is being with illustrations. And this one is the London Journal from 1893. Lady Audley is still being published. So this is 30, 40 years later. There she is again. That is Mary Braddon. And I want to end with that portrait. And I do want to have questions as well, because I just want to read a little from the very end of the book. This is a portrait by Frith, with whom Braddon became good friends. And as you can see, it presents her as an author. It was exhibited in the Royal Academy. She is demurely dressed in black, her books, her writing implements on the table. Jane Austen, in a self-satirizing letter, imagined a portrait of herself in the Royal Academy, all simpering with curls and what have you. She couldn't imagine it. Austen couldn't imagine this kind of public profile. But as I say, I want to end with Mary Braddon's extreme ambivalence about her own fame. And indeed, the problems faced by all the women in this book, as they try somehow to take the problem of their sex out of the equation. They all write in the shadow of the fall of the tree of knowledge of Eve. They write in worlds in which words and the word belong to men, as does social, economic, and political power. They write with and against the myths they inherit, and not only those concerning sex and gender. They negotiate with, retell, rewrite foundational texts, whether the Bible, fairy tales, or Shakespeare. They write knowing that silence is the safer path, but it is not the one they take. The women in this book know they will need to collaborate with men. Indeed, they are dependent on men, whether within the family or beyond, and that if they earn money, let alone good money, someone will dust down the age-old link between sex work and literary work and use it against them. From Julian of Norwich to Mary Elizabeth Braddon, they write knowing that it is never simply a matter of getting the works written, tough though that can be. They will then find it harder than their male contemporaries to reach readers, whether in their own time or beyond. No wonder They often long to take their gender out of the equation, despair at how what we now call identity politics are weaponized against them. Because above all, each and every author writes knowing that their selves, as much as their literary works, will be scrutinized. That fear, that reality, is a powerful one. And it leads some people, when considering women's work, women's creative work, to say, let's not do biography, because by focusing on the woman's life and experiences, we are focusing on the wrong thing. We should need to look at the text as text. I have a lot of sympathy for that. But what I wanted to try to do was to hold both in focus. Try to hold both the life and the work in the same frame. Because for me, it remains the most powerful way to appreciate these women's achievements as authors, and above all, to understand why still today, they and their work constitute an alternative history to English literature. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Anna. We've got just a couple of minutes for questions. So I don't know if anyone has questions. Oh, we've got hands going up.
Thank you for that. How did you decide to leave out? I think people like Austen, Julian,
Yes,
Mary Robinson, all of them include your book.
absolutely. That would have made it an encyclopedia, and there are those available to us all. There are lists. In some ways, we are fact rich in our world now. One click in Wikipedia and we can find out about these women, many of them anyway. So two answers. One, instead of thinking who I left out, though I could tell you some of the ones on the cutting room floor, heartbreakingly, I had to think, who did I want to be in there for the way in which they perhaps opened up perspectives, wider perspectives. So, for example, Lady Mary Wortley Montagu, I could have chosen somebody else from the 18th century, but I wanted somebody who was first and foremost a travel writer, somebody who was going to another culture, another religion, and negotiating that, but also somebody who was a writer but not a published author, to make us rethink about that. So, yes. Other writers are in there simply because they were the first. Indeed, they were the only. So the earlier writers get in there in a much more straightforward way. But yes, by the 18th century, oh my goodness, it was hard. And then knowing where to stop, because originally I wanted to bring the book up to date, but quite rightly, I decided to stop with World War I, with a woman who lived from the 1830s through to World War I, because I felt that was a line in the sand. But it was astonishingly difficult. But my hope is that by these kind of micro histories, that the reader will start seeing the patterns formed by the 8 that I have chosen, but could imagine a related but slightly different pattern that would emerge if I'd chosen eight others. And that is part of what I'm trying to do. It is an alternative. Also, I love their writing, the ones that are
You mentioned the connection between literary work and how it gets connected to sort of sex work, as it were. When do you think that changed?
I don't think it has. I think creative women who are in public are still sexualized. You only have to look at, I think it was the Finnish Prime Minister, young woman going out partying and the media being in, so any woman in authority is going to be scrutinized, sexualized in a completely different way to the way in which I believe men in authority are understood. So I don't think that has changed. I think I mentioned a rapper in my opening chapter. I don't give her name, but I was referring to Megan Thee Stallion, who has done shock horror and X-rated video and won loads and loads of Grammys. She is a superb artist. The quickest way to get clicks on her name is to bring up the fact that she might or might not have been a sex worker. So I think we're still living with it. I think that the fact that I had to decide how much lipstick to wear today shows that we're still living with it. Yeah.
I think we've got time for one more question. Who's that going to be? Right.
Obviously your title of your book is Eve Bites Back. How do you think the Eve myth ties into that correlation between like female authors and sex work?
Yeah, I think it's part of the same picture, obviously, that Eve's beauty, Adam's desire for Eve, is understood by many as the problem. You know, she was too beautiful, he couldn't say no, and he succumbed to her feminine wiles, as it were. And again, I really am not over egging, I'm not overstating it when I say that this this fear of women expressing desire, it's mapped then onto Mary Magdalene, who or no, more importantly, I should say, Eve in one corner, the Virgin Mary in the other. So this is all so obvious that we almost don't spot it anymore. I mean, I think we've lived with this for so many millennia. And strangely, I mean, it's a lovely title, I adore it, but I thought, oh, it's going to be a bit of a stretch in the 19th century, isn't it? And no, there's a wonderful paragraph in Lady Audley's Secret, and I'm not going to give away any plot spoilers, but in which a character says about another character, she is like Eve. She has brought evil into the world, and I must resist this. And this character ends up marrying an entirely, almost Dickensianly sexless girl figure, you know, who has no desire, no volition, no agency at all. So yeah, I think Eve is still haunting us now.
I think we are coming to the end of our session, and our virtual audience will be departing as if by magic.
Okay.
But I just wanted to say thank you so much, and for a really fascinating talk. This was a bit of a sneak peek, I think.
It is. The book is not officially out until the 13th of October.
But is there any way in which people can get
Well, funnily enough, if you do want to be one of the most select few in the entire world who can own this book a few weeks ahead of publication, I will be selling and indeed signing, if you would like me to sign it, copies in reception as you make your way out of the main entrance of Kellogg. So do please come by. I can also answer other questions if you have them at the time. To people who are here, apologies to the people who are joining me virtually.
Who will be able to buy it from
13th of October, yes.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.